So we've got some great talks to close out this second session. We're going to start with Dr. Riley Bernard. And Dr. Bernard is an assistant professor of zoology and physiology at the University of Wyoming, so just across the border, just north of here. She is an applied wildlife biologist with a focus on answering conservation-related questions on cryptic species such as bats and amphibians. So Dr. Bernard will be presenting Under the Spans, investigating bridge use by bats in Wyoming. Thanks, Dr. Bernard.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Andrea, for putting this together for all of us today. And thank you all for coming and for coming back from break. I appreciate it. So the work I'm going to highlight today is actually part of my former student, Logan. He graduated and is working at Casper College now, but he conducted this whole research project in Wyoming. And many of you may have read his lit review in Acta Characterologica that kind of collates a bunch of the stuff that folks have been talking about today, too, about how bats are using bridges all over the globe. But if you haven't been to Wyoming, it's in the red square. We're in the Star State, so just north, like Andrea said. It has lots of wild spaces where wildlife can roam fairly unimpeded. However, as our country's reliance on energy increases, conversion of these once open landscapes to traditional extractive industries, like you can see on the right there, as well as wind and solar energy is becoming quite common. And as an example, the Wyoming Energy Authority's motto is empowering our nation with an all of the above energy mix, meaning that in the state just north of us here, there's a lot of open ground that's being converted to some form of energy. And in addition to this, Wyoming has one of the highest wind energy potentials in the US. So there's a lot of things going on in the state just north of here. And a recent study by Fabian et al. Suggests that roads with low to medium traffic volumes can affect the activity of clutter-adapted and open-adapted species within 0 to 300 meters of roads in woodlands, and then up to 500 meters of roads in open lands. And Sumali kind of talked about that as well. Jacobson et al. Assessed the role of wildlife behavioral responses to traffic volume, kind of to predict this idea of barrier effects from vehicle-caused mortalities and avoidance, and proposed these kind of 4 categories of behavioral responses based on the perceived danger of traffic. So we have non-responders, like our butterflies. We have pausers and speeders, much like our cervids, squirrels, and snakes. But our bats were found to kind of fall in this avoider category, similar to grizzly bears. And some bats are known to recognize moving vehicles as threats and respond by avoiding the road at much lower traffic volumes and further distances than pausers and speeders. So again, Wyoming's easy to map, so it's square, but you can see here that in the state of Wyoming, traffic volumes are traditionally very low, as noted by the purple, which means 0, very low traffic. But there's these regions that have high traffic volumes, and as we see this build out of energy, we can expect more and more volume within these areas to increase. In a review of the major threats and challenges of global bat conservation, Frick and colleagues ranked the major threats for bat species globally and found that activities such as human disturbance, urban development, and energy production are within the top 6 threats, and the creation and maintenance of transportation corridors is actually ranked 11th. And while increased traffic and traffic volume can pose a risk and issue for some species, we have been learning throughout this entire conference, and especially today, that transportation infrastructure build out can lead to these additional habitat or synanthropic species, such as bats. And bats are some of the best taxa at adapting to a changing landscape. It is widely known that bats use non-traditional roosts, such as bridges and culverts, throughout North America. However, little was known about these structures in the state of Wyoming, as the last inventory was conducted by Keeley and Tuttle back in the 90s, and only about 80 structures were identified. So in collaboration with the Wyoming Department of Game and Fish, as well as Wyoming Department of Transportation, we sought to determine if bats use bridges in the state of Wyoming. And if they did, what factors may best explain their use? And so we were looking at trying to determine what about the bridge characteristics, features crossed, and even location may prove to be informative in determining the likelihood of use by bats. So we collected data from June through August, so that active period of 2021 and 2022, and we were interested in the undersurface of YDOT managed bridges for the bats or bat sign, and reported bridge characteristics such as design, material, and feature crossed. So some of the information we collected were the type of roost. So we used the term used, which means that we saw guano or urine staining there, but no physical presence of bats. So much like what you see Logan looking at right here. We also had day use. So that would be a single adult female or adult individuals no young. And the maternity roost is that far right corner there, and that's where there's small, young, or non-bullet young. We also collected guano for species identification and swabbed areas where bats roost to look for the presence of PD, or the causative agent of white nose syndrome. And now I know we're at a transportation conference, so many of you know all about bridges, but many of you don't, and I was one of those. So I'm going to give a little brief tutorial about the bridge that we saw here. So the primary bridge types we encountered in Wyoming were T-beam, girder, and slab. And as a little, hopefully not incorrect way of describing these things to those who are engineers in the room, a T-beam bridge uses these kind of T-shaped beams as their primary structural members, and these beams support that concrete deck slab, and they also go against this abutment here. And if you're a bat, these are very, very attractive looking places. Girder bridges is a term used in construction to refer to the supporting horizontal beams that can be made from a variety of different construction materials, such as stainless steel, concrete, or even a combination of those. And again, a lot of great places for bats to hang out. Slab bridges are kind of these monolithic flat concrete beams, and they are usually pretty short. There's not a lot of surface for bats to hide in. And so we estimated that the likelihood of finding bridges there is probably pretty low. So let's get into some data. So looking at this graph here, we surveyed over 500 bridges across 19 counties, and we found that 366, or about 73% of bridges, were actually used by bats. So a lot of them. 359 sites were identified where bats were using them, so there's guano and urine staining, but the most significant findings were that there were 7 day and 6 maternity roosts. So ultimately, in the places that we surveyed, bats are using bridges all over the state. We did find that PD, or that causative agent of white nose syndrome, was found at 7 bridge roosts. And so there's another study that's going on now in my lab looking at viability of PD at these sites. But lots of cute little mamas and babies all over the state. So as an example of how bridge use varies, I'd like you to observe this time-lapse video that's hopefully working. Okay, great. So this is a bridge in Natrona County near Casper, and we found bats roosting on that concrete abutment on the bottom part of this figure here. And we said, okay, yep, it's a day roost. But you can see here, when we put this game camera up, that bats are continuing to use this roost throughout the night. They're actually on this kind of steel area where we thought, okay, there's no way bats would be there. You can see that they're crawling in the little areas, they're grooming. So bridges are being used by bats in a multitude of different functions, not just the place to hide during the day, but also to have social interactions, to digest, and just engage with each other. So while finding bats at bridges was exciting, one question we wanted to tackle was, what is it about these bridges that are attractive to bats? So using a generalized linear model framework, we found that bridge characteristics that best explain presence included that bridge design, so T-beam, girder, slab, etc., feature crossed, and abutment height, and this is all determined by AIC. And one of the important things to note is that design is in the top 5 figures, or graphs that we have here. Feature cross is also very important, as is the height of the bridge, but abutment height is that area that's kind of in the middle there. We can see where it kind of hits that area. That's going to be where bats are really liking that, and that's where we're finding a lot of our roosts too. And for those of you who aren't bat ecologists, a higher abutment height is actually really important because bats kind of have to fall a bit like Buzz Lightyear before they get lofted and take off. So the presence of roosts was about 2.1 times more likely to be observed at girder bridges and about 1.4 times more likely to be observed at T-beam bridges when compared to all other bridge designs that we encountered. And we found a 97% reduction in the use of slab bridges. Roost presence was 1.5 times more likely to be observed at bridges that cross bodies of water than bridges that cross roads or variations of bare ground. And we found a 58% reduction in roost presence at bridges that cross roads or transected bare ground, draws, and machinery passes. However, like I said, roost presence was actually 3 times more likely at bridges with taller abutments than bridges with shorter abutments. So they like big butts, they cannot lie. So, but given that, 359 of the 376 bridges that we had identified as being used by bats were not where we could actually get eyes on them, we wanted to see who was actually using these bridge roosts. And so like Andrea alluded to and what Faith will talk to a little bit more, using guano and DNA is actually a really great way of doing that. So I won't go deep into these details because I know Faith is going to take some time to do this, but we use this guano to help answer that question of who is actually using these bridge roosts. And as a aside that I will not talk about today, we're also looking at diet of bridge roosting bats using guano as well. So what we found though were that We collected guano from 322 of those bridge roosts and distinguished DNA sequences to 10 different bat species that are known to occur in Wyoming. And in Wyoming, we have about 18 to 19. There are also several sequences that we can identify beyond the genus level, and so they're identified to Myotis. But some of the big takeaways here is that we've all been talking about this idea of how in the West we don't have a lot of T&E species or threatened endangered species, at least not yet in the foreseeable future. However, the little brown bat, which is labeled as Mylu, was found at every single bridge roost that we collected guano from. And they are in early review for listing due to white nose syndrome. So this can be a huge issue for WYDOT when it comes to doing any type of maintenance and upkeep. Our western small-footed bat, who's doing fairly well with white nose syndrome, they're also found at almost every single bridge roost. But you can see we have a diverse suite of bats that are using these sites. And then what we also looked at were how many species were using a bridge roost. And again, this is just a one-time sample of guano, but we're finding that the areas in red here, those are bridges that have more than 3 different species using these sites. And so there's 2 bridges that actually had up to 5 different species using them. We don't know if that is at the same time, but regardless, bridges are being used a lot by bats in Wyoming. So because we actually are able to get that species ID, we're able to do a species based specific model to look at what exactly these species are keying in on as far as the resource. So for a little brown bat, which is the top, the model covariates that were most influential in them using a bridge roost were the size of that structure. So length, width, and height. But you can see that all of those things were very much important, even within 2AIC. Our western small-footed bat really was liking, again, length and width, but abutment height was also very important for that determination of use. So there's a little bit of difference as far as looking at bats writ large and how they choose bridges and then going into species-specific models. So I told you that there are 18 species of bats in Wyoming. There's now 19, thank you very much. We actually identified a whole new species to Wyoming using the guano that we collected at a bridge roost, so cave Myotis. This is like the most northerly documented detection of them. It's through guano, so no hands and eyes on the species yet, but it was found in an area of southwestern Wyoming that makes sense geographically, so pretty exciting. All right, so this figure here is called a bipartite graph, and it shows these connections between 2 groups. On the left, we are looking at the 3 primary features crossed, so flowing water, road or railroad, and other. And other, according to WYDOT, includes things like machinery passes, wildlife, overpasses, and dry creeks. And on the right are all the bat species that are identified using bridge roosts. And so what we can see is that most bat roosts were found at bridges that cross flowing water. However, each species, excluding pallid bats, California Myotis, and the cave Myotis, were documented at bridges that crossed all of these features. The pallid bat was found at bridges that crossed water or other. California Myotis was found at the other, and then the cave Myotis was only found over flowing water. The other thing that we wanted to do is because we had all this interesting information and determining presence and absence, we wanted to be able to create a predictive model so that agency members and WYDOT were able to kind of get an idea about how often these bridges are going to be used by bats to kind of help minimize cost. So we found that while we get the most features and dimensions from WYDOT, they actually don't measure abutment height. That's actually something that we were measuring in the field. Therefore, we created a predictive model based on height of the bridge, which is at that center point, as it was ranked 3rd in the AIC model selection. So using the information we gathered on those 500 bridges, we created this predictive model of bridge use by bats in the state, at least we're attempting to. And so reminder that we actually found 72% use, and it makes sense given that everything is about, in the purple there, is about 75% likelihood or probability. So it makes sense. We have a lot of bats using bridges all over the state, and we're able to see that that's kind of tracking, at least on these are WYDOT managed bridges. The area in the tan or orange, those are less than 25% probability, and those are along the I-80 corridor, which is mostly slab. So again, makes sense. We saw a big reduction in bats using those. Again, we can examine this for species-specific stuff, and little browns, again, found everywhere. Their likelihood of use is very high throughout the state, even in some of those areas over in slabs. We can see a little bit more nuance in our western small-footed bat as far as, the likelihood of use is a little bit lower, but that can be useful for trying to triage management. So we're starting to play with putting these predictive model outputs into a Shiny app where this data can be easily accessible to agency personnel wanting to be able to get out there and do maintenance and upkeep of bridges. And so right now, agencies like WYDOT hire consultants to go see if there's bats present at any type of bridge. And while that might seem like a good use of funds, we actually might be able to help triage bridges in need of a full-blown survey because we can actually highlight the likelihood of use here. And as this plays out, you can see there's multiple different ways of looking at this. You can also, I put in species specific use too. And so this is all kind of in that beta testing right now, but pretty exciting, and why not you to have access to this. So some next steps that we're going to be doing is actually this summer I have 2 teams of undergrads that are going to be going out and ground truthing our model. And so they're going to be going into the northeastern area of the state where northern long-eared bats and tricog bats are estimated to be, as far as a tiny little bit in Wyoming. And then also go down to that southwestern corner that was undersurveyed, but also had that identification of Vela there. And then we just got funded through WYDOT to have another project, a master's project investigating the ecology of bat use of bridges. And this is getting a bit more at that differential use by various demographic groups. So looking at sex, reproductive status, and age, timing and duration of use, right? Like many of us have talked about, the time that we go out to survey these bridges is one time point. And we say it's either a day roost if we see bats, or it's a night roost or used. So trying to get at what time of year or how these bats are using these sites could be really informative, especially if they're used at any point in time for maternity roosts. Getting at that multi-species use, as well as, like I said, diet and foraging, because that can also be very influential. So with that, I do think I have time for questions. A lot of people helped out with this. But yeah, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Riley. Excuse me, Dr. Bernard. Any questions? Yeah.
Thanks for your talk. That was super interesting. I had a question on kind of like, was there the abutment height? Was there like a steep drop off of like, you really liked 100 feet, 200 feet, but like at 50 feet, nobody liked it anymore? Like, is there a clear delineation in the height that was preferred? And kind of what is that, if there is?
Yeah, so I made it into meters because that's sciencey, right? So yeah, there was, I mean, shorter abutment height, so less than 2 meters was usually with most often slabs. And so that was also a factor that they weren't using that. But anything above that, I think 2 meters to 3 meters was kind of that where we saw more. But of course, that was with bigger structures and being overflowing water. So it kind of is nuanced, but taller over 2 meters was something that they tend to use more. Yeah. Yeah.
I wasn't gonna handle that.
Yes, thanks. This is really, really interesting. I have 2 quick questions. So I think if I got this right, so you surveyed about 500 bridges in the state, and 7 were confirmed day roosts and 6 maternity roosts. So then were you confirming that the others were night roosts by default? Or is that just sort of, I mean, unless you actually see the bats night roosting, then you obviously don't know, especially if you're just looking for signs of presence.
Correct. Yeah. So those were based off of a single survey. And so we actually came away from saying night roost because we don't know.
Right.
We just know that there's signs. So we said used. We did have a couple that we resurveyed the second year, and they were still maternity roosts or day roosts, and some flipped, and it was at the same time of year. So, but yeah, it was based on that one time point.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then the model that you're creating is really exciting, and I was wondering if there might be any opportunity to share that with other agencies when it's complete.
Yes. Yes. That's the plan. Yeah.
Okay, last question.
So I know that you looked at like over water and like rail. Did you consider temperature and bridge orientation in any of your models in terms of the likelihood of the increase of usage of some versus others?
Yeah, so we didn't do orientation. We were looking at temperature, but I was at the time done just with a kestrel. We do have some eye-button readings that we're going to be adding to the model too for some of those maternity roosts. For this next iteration, we're actually have a laser temperature meter, so we can get a reading at the actual, or where the roost is itself, and that's going to be included into the next iteration of the model. So yeah, but orientation is also something we're going to be adding.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Bernard.